Chapter 8. The indomitable will of Evander Drake was about to meet its match, and ultimately, its defeat. His plans for a well-balanced life were reaching their peak when a telegram from his manager, Wilson, changed everything. Standing on the pier, watching his family sail away, he felt as though he were trapped in a terrible nightmare. He mechanically shook his white handkerchief, watching helplessly as his loved ones disappeared into the distance, as if they were being transported to another world. He longed for the ground to open up and swallow him whole. He stood rooted to the spot, his excitement turning to a cold sweat, when Laura grabbed his arm and asked, "Father, what's wrong?" Colonel Drake's sturdy frame shook like a ship that had struck a hidden reef. He rallied from his stupor, taking Mr. Lee's arm as he was led to a waiting carriage. "You must forgive my momentary distress, Mr. Lee," said the man, his voice shaking slightly. "It is a truly terrible experience to be suddenly separated from one's family." "I understand, Colonel Drake," replied Lee. "I had a similar experience recently when I bid farewell to my family in Liverpool and came alone to America. Even temporary separation from loved ones can be difficult." But Colonel Drake quickly regained his composure and began to plan for the afternoon. He sent a telegram to Mr. Wilson and said, "We will leave New York at 6 o'clock this evening for Drakeville. But in the meantime, Mr. Lee, let us make the most of our time. Driver, take us to the Stimpler Hotel via the Produce Exchange." Colonel Drake had left the Waldorf Hotel, not wanting to draw attention to himself under the circumstances. The ride down West Street in New York City was far from pleasant, as the road was crowded with all manner of vehicles transporting goods to and from ships and warehouses. But Lee was struck by the sheer scale of the city's trade. West Street led them to Battery Park, where Colonel Drake explained that the Metropolitan Elevated Railway terminated. Lee was fascinated by the railway, which was elevated above the ground and powered by steam engines. "In London," he said, "we are forced to travel underground in foul air and darkness. Here in Battery Park," continued Colonel Drake, "Sir Guy Carleton's British Army embarked on November 25th, 1783. New Yorkers still celebrate that day as Evacuation Day. And nearby, Hendrik Christiansen built 4 small houses and a redoubt for a Dutch fur trading company, laying the foundation for America's metropolis. In 1626, Peter Minuit, the first governor of the New Netherlands, bought Manhattan Island for just $26. Lee also visited the tall Washington Building, which now stands where the headquarters of Lords Cornwallis and Howe once stood. He told Laura that in July of 1776, crowds of people had gathered in Battery Park to celebrate the Declaration of Independence, and they had even knocked over the equestrian statue of George III, which was melted down and used to make bullets for the war effort. "Yes," said Colonel Drake, "in the early days Americans may have lacked appreciation for art, but we always gave our cousins across the sea a warm welcome." "Colonel Drake," said Mr. Lee, "I've always been curious about why you chose to build the Bunker Hill Monument near Boston." "Because we Americans beat the British," replied Colonel Drake. "But that's not true, Colonel," said Lee. "The British troops, under General Gage, actually drove the American forces off both Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill." "Father's right," added Laura. "It was a British victory." The tall obelisk, made of Quincy granite, stood in Charlestown to honor the brave resistance put up by the provincial militia against the British soldiers. This event strengthened the Americans' belief that they could win their freedom. Miss Drake helped Mr. Lee, and he thanked her, saying that a patriot is a rebel who succeeds, and a rebel is a patriot who fails. They noticed a clever sign over an American flag dealer's entrance that read, "Colors guaranteed not to run." The group went to the impressive Produce Exchange building in New York, which had beautiful Italian Renaissance architecture. The main hall was bustling with the intense bargaining of its members, reminding Mr. Lee of a battle without cavalry or artillery. Laura wanted to climb the Campanile, a decorated tower that rose 225 feet high, to see the breathtaking view of lower New York, the Bay, Brooklyn, Long Island, and the mountains of New Jersey. They hoped to catch a glimpse of the Majestic, but she had already sailed down the Narrows and out of sight. Mr. Lee wanted to see Trinity Church, so they drove up Broadway to the head of Wall Street. The church's spire was graceful and 284 feet high. The English government granted the land on which it stands in 1697, and it had other magnificent endowments. Trinity Parish, the richest church organization in the United States, had revenues of over $500,000 a year. In revolutionary times, royalist clergy read prayers for the King of England until their voices were drowned out by the drum and fife of patriots marching up the center aisle. After lunch at the Hotel Stimpler, the Drake party left New York for Drakeville on their own private car on the fast Western Express at 6 o'clock. The express slowly crept along the Steel Way, under cross streets, through arched tunnels, and over the Harlem River until it reached the Hudson River, which it followed for 142 miles to Albany, the capital of the Empire State. This ride on the American Rhine was unparalleled, passing through tunnels, over bridges, past the magnificent summer houses of the metropolis's magnates that adorned the high bluffs, past wooded hills and winding dales, grand mountains and sparkling rivulets. Every object was rich with historic memories. This ride in June was only surpassed by the forests ablaze with autumnal splendor. The battlemented cliffs of the Palisades were visible for 20 miles. Mr. Lee spotted Sunnyside from the car, covered with nourishing vines grown from slips that Irving secured from Sir Walter Scott at Abbotsford. Passing Tarrytown, Colonel Drake mentioned that Major Andre was captured there, and Benedict Arnold's treachery was exposed, or else they might still be paying tribute to the Crown of Great Britain. Mr. Lee replied that George Washington, a patriot, hung Major Andre, the spy. The year was 1901, and the train was headed towards the Highlands, a popular tourist spot. West Point, home of the U.S. Military Academy, could be seen on the left bank of the Hudson. As the sun set behind the Catskills, Colonel Drake suggested that Mr. Lee climb the mountains, which were a popular destination for those seeking respite from the heat and stress of daily life. The area boasted several hotels, with one offering a stunning view of the Hudson panorama. The Adirondacks were also nearby, providing a haven for hunters and fishermen. During the journey, Laura invited her friend Nellie Eastlake to join them for dinner, and the group enjoyed the company of this charming and gracious woman. Despite their worries and troubles, Nellie's presence lifted their spirits and made them forget their problems for a while. She was a tall and captivating woman, with eyes that could deceive the morning. Her ability to connect with others had won her many friends in her youth. While attending school on the Hudson, she met the wealthy father of a classmate. Later, she was invited to travel with her friend and her widowed father, Mr. Eastlake, among the Thousand Islands and down the St. Lawrence River. She impressed the millionaire so much that after graduating from Smith College, she accepted his marriage proposal. Now, she was on her way to their luxurious home on the Pacific coast. She deftly steered the conversation at dinner, avoiding unpleasant topics. After dinner, they spent half an hour listening to music and reading magazines before retiring for the night. As the express approached Lake Erie, they agreed that Mr. Lee should join Mrs. Eastlake and Laura in the car Alfonso and spend a day or two at Niagara Falls. Colonel Drake kissed Laura goodbye and bid farewell to everyone. He then took a seat in a Pullman and continued his journey alone to Drakeville. He hoped to set things right at the steel mills before Mr. Lee arrived home. Left to his own thoughts, he reflected on a time when he was proud of his ability to work hard at the forge. He was now proud of his great wealth and growing power in the manufacturing world. When he was poor, he believed that the forces hidden within him, if used at the right time and place, would make him a man of influence. He was skilled in shaping and tempering tools of every kind, and he could fashion bolts, nails, and horseshoes that were unsurpassed in the county. When he ate his cold dinner and reheated his coffee over the forge coals, he often thought of the dormant fires within him, wondering if they would ever be fanned to a white heat. For years he had worked hard to pay the rent of his forge and home and his monthly bills. His wife was saving and helpful in 1,000 ways, but life was a hard struggle from sun to sun. One summer day when work was slow, a tall Englishman came to his shop to get a small job done. Drake performed the work so well that the Englishman, James Thorn, said to him, "I believe you are the mechanic I have long been looking for. In early life I was apprenticed in England to a famous ironmaster, and when the Bessemer patents for converting iron into steel were issued, it was my good fortune to be a foreman where the first experiments were made by Henry Bessemer himself. So I came to have a practical knowledge of Bessemer's valuable invention." but my health failed, and for 6 months I have been in your country in search of it. Now that I am well again, I plan to start a Bessemer steel plant in America, if possible." Evander Drake quickly saw the potential for great profits from Bessemer's patents and Thorn's ideas. However, he knew he needed to learn more about the patents and how they worked before proceeding. Within a week, Thorn had taught him a great deal about the practical aspects of the Bessemer process for converting iron into steel. Bessemer claimed that his steel rails would last much longer than the iron rails in use at the time, and Drake saw the potential for large profits. Drake and Thorn agreed to split any profits equally. Thorn provided reliable knowledge, while Drake enlisted capital. It was not easy for Drake to secure funding, as capital is often cautious and skeptical of new ideas. However, he eventually obtained enough money to conduct a successful experiment that convinced a few wealthy investors to provide more funding. The steel plant soon began producing high-quality steel rails at a reduced cost. Drake's management skills kept pace with the rapid growth of the enterprise, while Thorn's knowledge and inventiveness made him the ideal superintendent of the steel plant. At first, railway managers were skeptical of the steel rail's benefits, as they were largely theoretical. However, the steel rail's durability at the joints made it highly desirable, and orders poured in. The steel mill operated day and night, and the company made large additions to the mills to keep up with demand. Money was vital to the company's success. Drake initially believed he deserved a larger share of the profits than Thorn, and eventually bought most of Thorn's interest in the steel plant. Drake's interests grew until he practically owned the Drakeville Iron and Steel Works and other properties. As a millionaire, Clark had always been aware of the vast disparities in society. He knew that people like James Thorn, who was merely a departmental superintendent at a steelworks, were often undervalued and underpaid. It was a great injustice that Thorn had to bear, and Clark could empathize with his plight. Thorn had been instrumental in helping Colonel Drake gain the knowledge and expertise needed to manufacture steel rails successfully. However, despite his contributions, Thorn's income remained nominal, and he felt that he had been wronged. Clark had heard Thorn's story several times, and he knew that it had left a deep impression on Colonel Drake's mind. As the express hurried him back to Drakeville, Drake couldn't help but think of the great wrong that had been done to Thorn.